I'd like to welcome everyone to the ARF Virtual Town Hall on the coronavirus. This is Scott McDonald, and I'm the President and CEO of the Advertising Research Foundation. This event sort of grew out of our admiration of a very intense and learned dialogue happening over the last several weeks on the wonks list. And we thought it a worthwhile sort of response at the ARF to bring this to a broader audience and spotlight a couple of the folks who had kind of led the discussion in different ways on the wonks list. So I am pleased to welcome to this event Rex Briggs, the Executive Chairman of Marketing Evolution, Jerome Shimizu, co-founder of ABCS Insights, and Rick Bruner, the CEO of Central Control and the founder of Research Wonks. Rex and Jerome will present data, and then Rick and I will join for a kind of moderated discussion. We encourage all of you to participate. You can use your chat box to sort of comment as you go along. If you do want to ask a question to the panelists, please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. We are recording this broadcast today, and we'll be sending out a link in a follow-up email that you will be able to view on demand or share with your colleagues. I will also say we've had a very unprecedented level of demand for participation in this today. We have upwards of 600 registrants, and it seems to be challenging the Zoom platform a little bit. We've had some signals this morning. There's a lot of activity on Zoom right now, not just our event. So we apologize in advance if you experience any instability or difficulty getting in. So with that, let me turn the stage over to Rick, who will introduce the panelists.
Hi, Scott. Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. I'm Rick Bruner. As Scott said, I'm CEO of Central Control, which is an ad performance measurement company. And 15 years ago, I started a forum called the Research Wonks, better known as the Wonks. And it is more than 1,000 members of our community of media and advertising research specialists. We are not health specialists, but because we are a lot of analytical data people in this moment of international urgency, we've had this robust conversation that we wanted to open up to everybody. I have the pleasure of knowing several of the folks on the call for several years. Rex was my boss at one point a few years back, and we've known each other for 20 plus years. With respect to the Research Wonks, many of you I know are on it. Those of you who are not on it, I welcome you to join. It is a free community. It's an email-based community. Our timing is a little off. We are in the midst of relaunching the service, and it probably will not be available until tomorrow. But if you go to researchwonks.com, there will be an easy mechanism for you to sign up and join that community and join these conversations there. So without further ado, I want to get to our content and welcome our first speaker, my old friend and former boss, as I say, Rex Briggs.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to go ahead and dive into a few parts. First of all, if you want to follow along with my slides, I've made them available on my LinkedIn page. So there's an article that has a link to the slides right here. And I'm sorry, right here. And then all of the reference materials that I'll be referring to are sourced in the slides and in here as well. And I'll share with you some of that data as we go along. Let me go ahead and dive in to a big part of this discussion, since Yeah, this has been something that I've been tracking very closely since January, when the Chinese government announced their quarantine, and that hit my news feed. And I decided to take a look at the model that they had that suggested that they would hit the peak in February with about 10,000 cases globally. I ran the numbers and said, "There's no way. That's off by at least an order of magnitude. There, this is going to be a much more serious issue." And began to dive deeply into the analysis. So I've been doing forecasting for 27 years, and just to give you a quick background on my approach to forecasting, I think of it as three pillars. The first one is the systems data, and those are fairly known pieces of information that you can research, you can measure, you can get a quantitative assessment of. The second one is consumer psychology, and there's a little bit, again, data and information available, but there's also using a lot of historical data and patterns to think about how consumers make the choices that they make. And then finally, when I was director at research at Wired 20 plus years ago, I learned this quote: "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And this has been an incredibly powerful way of looking within the data at information that is ahead of the curve, and then thinking about how that's going to transition into the mainstream as a way of better understanding how those patterns will play out and getting a better forecast. So within that part, I will go ahead and take you through a bit more information. And I'm going to give you the background and facts first. This is a timeline, and you'll see some of the data that I've analyzed, and we'll come back to the charts on the bottom in a moment. But basically, this started in November, December. The earliest data I found in the records is a November entry around the symptoms, probably around our Thanksgiving time. That was somewhere around patient 0. By January 3rd, there were 44 cases in total. The causal agent had not been identified. Within a few days, it had not only been identified, but it had been sequenced. And unfortunately, it also spread outside of China to Thailand by the 13th. A few days later, Japan, a few days later, Korea. And as some of you will know from the Diamond Princess cruise, that saga begins to unfold. On the 19th, the passenger who would turn out to have the coronavirus flies to Japan to board the ship and disembarks on the 25th and tests positive on the 31st. Which causes the Diamond Princess cruise to go into quarantine. A week earlier, China goes into quarantine on the 23rd. It's amidst the Lunar New Year, lots and lots of travel. And then on the 25th was the first model, which I had analyzed, and I had posted on the 30th, arguing that this was not, it was going to be a lot worse than what they were initially modeling. Who declared an emergency on the 30th? So you can go from 44 cases to 9,720 in about a month. And during that period of time, we're able to gather some data and information. I was able to get access to some data directly from China on individual cases, and it allowed me to produce charts like looking at the number of days from symptoms to death, and from initial symptoms to hospitalization. Additional research was done looking at the incubation period of time, which turns out to be about 5 to 6 days, about 5 days before you get a cough, about 6 days before you develop a fever. And within 14 days, 99% of people will have had the symptoms, though there are some outliers as far out as 21 days. That's an important fact, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. So, just to give you an idea of some of the data that I was looking at, this was a sample of data that I had pulled down. It had the individual age, sex, where, latitude, longitude, where it happened, information about symptoms and chronic diseases, and the date that they were, if they died, the date that they died, and other information, which allowed me to calculate, the amount of information from hospitalization to death. I mean, just incredibly rich information. including this this information here, which has to get translated from Chinese, but this is individual data on individual people, the symptoms that they had, and so forth. So incredibly rich respondent level data that that became useful for me in some of the modeling and analysis and so forth. So coming back to what we were looking at here, one of the things I think is quite important is to recognize that from the 23rd, within a month, China began to see the top of their outbreak. We began to see the leveling off and slowing of the growth. In fact, it may have happened earlier, but some of the testing and so forth made, you know, this big jump here was a change in how they were counting cases and so forth. As we went further, you know, add another month to the calendar here, we look at February, Diamond Princess cruise, around 3,700 passengers and crew. They were quarantined on the 5th, and there was, at this point, about 191 cases, you know, outside of China. You can see that grow to 6,000 by the end of February. And on the top, you see the timeline for the Diamond Princess cruise. I went very deep into the data on the Diamond Princess cruise because for me, it answered one of the really tough questions, which is, what really is the infection rate? What is the fatality rate? How many people die if they get this infection? What can we expect? Because it was a closed population. It was one where we knew what the denominator is. It's around 3,700 or 3,711 to be precise. And everyone was getting tested, so we could figure out what the infection rate was. They put a quarantine in the 3rd. We could see what happens when you put a quarantine in. And it was incredibly important and informative. And what you see from the time of the quarantine, which you see is 2 weeks later, you see the top of the trend, and it began to grow very slowly thereafter. And that is really good news. Now, the not so good news that goes along with this is that the exposure to symptoms of 5 days also included about half of the people on Diamond Princess cruise being completely asymptomatic, which means that they're spreading it and they're not even knowing that they're sick and spreading it. And then the recovery time, we are learning, is you know, certainly, you know, quite long. There are still today over 150 people in Japan in the hospital from the Diamond Princess cruise, with 15 incubated or in ICU. But you know, many people did get better. Many people did get better within, and certainly the spread stopped within the 2 weeks. So going forward in the data a bit here, you know, I'll share with you that I wrote an article on February 10th because I was scratching my head saying, wow, consumer confidence has not come down. The US is 130.7, as you see on the chart on the right. Our stock market had not adjusted. And that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me as I looked at the supply chain implications, the implications to tourism, to the US economy and business globally. And yeah, that's one of the other topics we'll talk about today. But I want to go deeper into why I was concerned about this lack of adjustment and something that I thought was going to be a pretty big deal. But I do want to make the point before I go there that there is some good news in this data, which is that the best news I've seen is that, you know, within a month in China, within 2 weeks on a Diamond Princess cruise, and within about 2 weeks in South Korea of quarantines, we've seen an incredible fast slowing of the spread of the virus. To go a bit deeper into the data, we are seeing cases in Italy, Spain, the US shooting up. And we do know that there's a very slow recovery, which you'll see in this chart here. Really, the only people who've recovered so far are the ones that got it earlier in China. And there's very little recovery rates when you look at, say, Italy, for example, at this point, because it does take 3 to 4 weeks for recovery. So one of the models that I developed was a forecast, which we're referring to as forecast 1.0, because I expect that there'll be some point where there'll be a 2.0 and an update of it. But it was looking at how bad could it get. Now, I wrote this when there were 61 cases in the US because my concern was that we were not looking at the implications of how big this could be based upon the data that I was already modeling and analyzed from Hubei and so forth. So the model looks at 15% of the US population being infected, 49 million people. And based upon the fatality rates that I was calculating and projecting, that would mean 780,000 Americans would die of COVID-19 in 2020. And there'd be about 3.9 million critical or severe cases. Now, this would mostly affect people who are 65 and older, and 80% of these deaths would be among our elderly. It would be an incredible burden to obviously the families that would go through this and the medical system and so forth. This, by the way, is the age distribution from that Hubei analysis that I was able to get. So we were able to look at that spike and the jump up in at 65 and so forth. So going a bit deeper into that analysis and looking at where we're at today and the drivers of that analysis, I want you to look at the United States and recognize that each of these colored regions are about the same size as Hubei. Hubei is about 50 million people. Hubei represent about 75% of the cases in China and about 96% of the deaths. So it's not right to look at China and divide their numbers by 1.4 billion people. And it's not really right to look at the US and think that our hospital beds and ventilators and so forth are evenly distributed. What we're learning about this is that it becomes concentrated in different regions and areas. And we need to recognize that Hubei went into lockdown when there was 375 cases. In the Northeast region right now, as of last night, we have 1,082 cases. In the Western area where I live, over in the green, there's 1,206 cases. In the rest of the regions of the US, there's 1,275. So we are already further into this curve, far further into the curve, before we've had a coordinated reaction and response. So looking a bit deeper, I did some analysis because people are saying, well, how bad could it be? And these were people in New York so I decided to do analysis and said, well, what if New York City was Wuhan? It's about the same population in size. And what would that mean in terms of the implications? How seriously should we take this? And what I found in that analysis is, and by the way, in this analysis, I grabbed data from the cause of death in New York from 2014, what was available, and I summarized it by all the different causes, the leading causes, and we can see influenza here with killing an average of 6 people per day, and heart disease, the #1 killer, killing 45 people a day and a total of 145 people a day dying. And we were able to compare that to Wuhan, and if we had the same rate of growth that they saw, just in the month of February, COVID-19 would become the #1 killer in New York. It would increase our death rate by 50%, and it would be 13 times worse than the flu. Our medical capacity would be overwhelmed with 12,000 hospitalizations in the month, and our fatality rate would increase from the rate that I saw on the Diamond Princess cruise to more like what we see in Wuhan when the medical system gets overwhelmed. So the takeaway that I had from that analysis is we do not want to be like Wuhan. We want to do whatever we can to try to avoid that type of a situation emerging. So some of the other drivers I looked at in the model that you can find again on that LinkedIn post is the way that R0 works. And what I found myself doing when I would go to in February and I'd go and talk with people in my community and friends is I would pull out my iPad and I'd show them this table, because the exponential math was not getting through to people. But the basic way that it works is that one person might infect 3 if we use the R0 of 3, and then those 3 people infect 3 each. So now we're at 9, and those 9 then infect 3 each, so we're at 27. And it grows very quickly. And the argument was that the R0 is probably between 2 and 3. And R0 is a reproductive rate which can have a different number of days. So I decided to standardize that, make it really easy to track. So you could see a weekly reproduction rate. Not exactly the same as R0, but it makes it easier to use. So when I wrote the analysis, there were 62 cases in the United States. And I organized this table so that if doubters wanted to look at it and say, okay, well then come back in a week or two. And I might be wrong. Maybe it isn't as bad as I think it is. Maybe we could turn to March 15th and we could only have 105 cases, which would be a progression that was more similar to the flu, for example. But what we found instead is that we are at a rate where we are now at, if we were at 5, which I thought would be pretty high, we would hit that projection that I had of 15% of the US population, or about 50 million people. We would hit that in early May. And if we were down at 4, we would hit that mid-May, and we're at 3, we would hit that late May. And if we were much lower than that, then we would get into the territory where we might avert disaster, like if we get down to the 1.3 level. So where are we at today? And I'd encourage you to come back to this table in the LinkedIn thing on the each Sunday and look at where we're tracking. But we are currently at 3,563, which is in excess of 500% growth per week. So as we look at the model, we are tracing on a path that would put us into this range in May. And if we think about the mortality rate, which I'll come back to some of how I did some of that analysis, this is a very bad picture. On the other hand, things that are encouraging me is I am seeing a lot of social distancing. My family members that are in the Bay Area are part of the 7 million that need to shelter in place. And if we significantly lower that rate, we might be able to get down to 1% or 0.1%, and avert what could be a very bad picture. The key assumption that I had when I built this model is right down here at the bottom, and this is one that the optimist in me had to sort of contend with, which is that my view of consumer behavior, which you remember is one of those 3 pillars I use in the analysis, that consumer psychology, is what Scott, from his Harvard background, will know as the tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that in the Boston, where they had the commons, there was a free pasture and people would graze their cattle there. But because nobody really owned it, it basically got destroyed. People would use it, but they wouldn't invest back in it. That same view I had was of that we would look at our own risk, and if it was lower than, say, getting in a car accident in New York or some of these other risk areas, we wouldn't take action ourselves because there's more value for us in going out and doing the things we wanted to do than recognizing that in doing that, we increase the chance that we would spread things whether we knew it or not. And so my calculation was that it would take a shift in our perceptions of our risk. And I thought that would happen somewhere around 100,000 cases, or a risk of 1 in 3,000. Compare that to the risk of getting in a car accident in New York, which is about 1 in 8,000, or dying because of a car, which is about 1 in 16,000. It's get in that range, that would change behavior. So I have been encouraged that our behavior seems to have changed before that point, but I think there's still a lot more data that we need to look at how that social distancing effect is working. And if any of you have the location data that you want to share or engage in some analysis, I've reached out to a few people in the industry to work on that type of analysis, try to compare that to what happened in Italy and in South Korea to see whether or not we're even close to a level where we could change this assumption and lead me to downgrade this projection that we get to 49 million. Some of the other things that were drivers in the scenario is I looked at the H1N1, which got to 20% of the US population, looked at the 1918 Spanish flu, which got to 27% of the population, looked at the annual flu, which gets between 10 and 20% of the population each year, looked at the Diamond Princess cruise and how the quarantine worked and how much it grew, and it grew to about 20%, 15 to 20%. And looked at some of the early data on latitude and tried to see whether there was a good thesis that weather might help us. I think that it will, but we still need to do a lot of other behavior. And then I looked at calculating the infectious rate. And if those of you who want to get deeper into that paper want to go into the academic paper, you can see how I've done those calculations and analysis. And a few other academics have done the similar type of analysis. And we're thinking the rate of people who get the infection and die is about 1/2 to 0.4%, compared to a case fatality rate, which means people show up at the doctor and die, which is up in the 3% range. There are other scenarios out there. Harvard has a scenario that they think 40 to 70% of the population will get it. I think that's high and doesn't really account for how consumers would change their behavior as they change their risk calculation. But that's a plausible scenario that people put forth. The last main point I'll make before I hand over to Jerome in a few slides is that this is not the flu. And I was challenged with that question a bit, and I wanted to look at myself because, let's be data-driven about it. The flu kills about 50,000 people per year, range of 20 to 80,000. It's relatively predictable, and there is a vaccine that can significantly lower the risk. Coronavirus is not as predictable. There is no vaccine. And the most, I think, serious issue is that point I made earlier in the analysis, which is that half the people on Diamond Princess cruise were asymptomatic. Some new research just out of Italy yesterday, looking at 3,000 people in a village where they tested everybody, found that 50 to 70% of people were asymptomatic at that time. And that poses a huge challenge because people can infect others without even knowing that they're sick. And that is a serious problem. MIT talks about the issue being that you can shed the virus before symptoms show up. The other point is that based upon that Diamond Princess cruise data that I've analyzed and other academics have analyzed, is that we know that it's at least 5 times more deadly than the flu. And there's also this whole risk of secondary infections, which come along with the COVID, rarely happen with the flu, as MIT points out. And so really, I think this warrants a different type of response compared to how we handle the common cold. I pulled data from my own region and from New York as well, looking at the flu and its rates. And this is a curve at the bottom right corner for New York this year. And we are nowhere near this area in terms of new cases coming in for the coronavirus. And God help us if we get to that rate. We do not want to be there. Where we are is at this very beginning part of the curve. And here's what I found in analyzing the data. For the flu to go from their first person with it to 1,000 cases took 6.5 weeks this year in New York. COVID took just 2.5 weeks to get to 1,000 cases. It is moving faster than the flu. It is more infectious than the flu. And we know that it's more deadly. It's 4 to 6 times more deadly, depending on how severe the flu is. So I've used that 5 times more deadly than the flu and twice as contagious, or spreading at twice the rate as a shorthand. I think that's something you can share as well when people bring up that question of, well, isn't this just like the flu, and the flu kills 50 to 80,000 people? If we let this play out like the flu, this will kill a lot more people, and it will crush our medical system. So some reference points here you can see at the bottom is the average range of the flu infection from 36 to 51 million, which kind of brackets the range that I have. And then you see its rate of death from the IFR from 22,000 to 55,000. And you can again see the projections. My goal is for the projections to be wrong. I want to have to lower my forecast because it's too high. And the best way of doing that to stop the spread, based upon my data analysis, is to use a quarantine approach. The approach worked in China. It's worked on the Diamond Princess cruise. Just works in South Korea, and we will see in about 10 days if it works in Italy. And if it does, I think that gives us really strong evidence that that is the solution. I'll absolutely be open-minded and analyze data from location and see whether or not we can get close enough with this patchwork quilt of efforts that are being made around the country, but I am skeptical of that. I'm optimistic by how much things people are doing on their own, but I do think there needs to be a coordinated effort. I've personally reached out to my senators, to my investors that have connections on the left and the right, and I'm trying to get that message out there because I think that that's an important thing for us to be able to do. If you're interested in more of the analysis on how I come up with the rate of the IFR or the infectious fatality rate, you can read more about that in the academic article I've posted. If you're interested in looking at your own predictions of how big this can be, there's prediction markets that are looking at it, which I think are a great place to be able to share information. And then finally, obviously, hand washing, disinfectants. I do think there's a lot of enough evidence from the people that have done the quarantines that masks do help. My mind was boggled by why New York was telling people not to do that. But maybe there'll be some more discussion around what we can do individually to try to make a difference. I think testing is a big hole. We've tested 26 per million when I pulled this data, just ahead of Vietnam. But really, the United States, with all of our resources, we need to be doing so much more. South Korea is doing 4,000 per million last time I checked. So with that, Jerome, I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, before we pass it on to Jerome, let me just bring in a couple of questions that have been posted, really specific to your forecast. One from Michael McGeegan. Has the model taken into consideration relative population density? U.S. geography is unique compared to Europe due to spatial concentrations.
Yes, this is what you'll see is in a data set here. I had brought in, actually, I guess I don't have the data set open right now. Yes, I looked at the world density populations. I think we have a natural advantage because of our suburban and rural concentrations. But as I dug deeper into that information, what really drove in the conclusion of the model is that we should not assume an even distribution of cases. What we should expect is to have concentrations in cities or in dorm rooms or in prisons or any area where cruise ships where you have people more densely populated. And that also creates a problem for the medical system because our assumptions of, hey, we've got this number of respirators in the state of Nevada or in your state, fill in the blank. That's not just going to be how it plays out. It's going to play out where you need ones in more concentrated areas. And again, you have much more relatively lower risk in rural areas of the country.
And then the other question that I was going to pass along here comes from Daniel Mendez, wondering about the quality of the data sources that underlie the forecast, particularly given both the resistance in some countries toward publishing and releasing data. There's some unevenness in that, but also with the slow increase in testing and whether that might skew the data.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I was very skeptical of the data coming out of China. I wrote about the issues of data quality. That led me to look at our US data quality and something called the EDRS, which is the Electronic Death Reporting System, which is just an embarrassment that we don't have it, fully up to speed and running in a regular basis with high levels of compliance across all of our state and jurisdictions. The Inspector General gave a report saying, how far behind we were in that, and that's going to hurt us. So the best data quality, that's why the Diamond Princess cruise is such an important resource, because it is a known closed population where we have 100% testing and high quality information coming back out of the Japanese medical system at a point before they hit the crisis levels. I did not use Iran as a case, though they arguably will do some type of quarantine as well, because I don't have confidence in the data coming there. I do have confidence in South Korea's data. So the big issue that I also saw with the Diamond Princess cruise and that we'll have with the US is that if you start a quarantine, you'll still have this catch up of testing in cases that will show it spiking and increasing at what appears to be a faster rate than it really is increasing in the overall population. And so, you make some adjustments as you look at the numbers in that way, but I do feel very confident that you can get to a top of the virus with a quarantine approach in about a 2-week period of time. You have to then follow up with the people that get quarantined and make sure that they're isolating and tracing the people that they interact with and that they're isolating, as Singapore is doing. They're probably doing the best job at that, and again, producing really good quality data. But we can do a lot better in the United States in terms of our data quality to help us make better decisions.
Okay, and with that, we'll move on over to Jerome's presentation. There are other questions. We'll try to get back to them later in the session. Okay, great. Thanks, Rick.
I'm going to make a quick comment, if I could, that I see that the governor of New York is projecting the peak in 45 days.
Right in line with my original model back in January, which is a little bit sad. I was hoping we would beat that time range.
Okay, take it away, Jerome.
Okay, great. All right, can you guys hear me okay? So I'm going to take you through, how really the coronavirus is now creating this step change in consumer behavior. Going to start out with some of the same kind of background facts and forecasts Rex took you through, but I want to really slice the data in a different direction. There's just so much going on with this. There's a number of different ways to look at this that will really help you understand what's going on. And then get a little bit more into the implications for business, and in particular what we're seeing so far on the ground in terms of brand reaction to this disaster, this threat is going. In particular, how that's going to affect DTC. So to start with, one different way to slice the data is here to look at this as country by country, what's going on. We've been hearing about in the news how this has been so serious, what's been happening in China. But I think what's surprising is just how bad it's gotten everywhere else. And when you adjust for the population size of China, you can take a look here. This data is from 14th. It's already old, but you can see that there's now 18 countries that have more severe outbreaks of coronavirus than China. The situation in Italy is by far the worst. It's, again, adjusting for population on a per capita basis, the outbreak is now something like 40 to 50 times worse in Italy. So it's a really serious situation on the ground there. The other thing here, and I think Rex was touching on a little bit with some of the discussions there of the clusters and looking at the data not just at a country level, but looking at it at a region level as well. But it's this large group of patients or consumers that are ending up in the serious or critical bucket. This is a big problem here because we're watching just the increase in the mortality rate, but there's also a very large number of people that either require health care, they need to require hospitalization, and potentially require a ventilator. And based on some of the early reporting out of China, we're seeing that there's actually a very large number of people in this category that may survive the virus, but they may be left with some permanently reduced lung function. So there's going to be a long-term secondary problem that we're going to face as a society with this outbreak, especially the bigger and bigger these numbers get. So also slicing the data a little different way, taking a look at who's been having success with this. We're seeing it actually at the top of the list. The lowest per capita infection rates are in places like India and Pakistan, which is pretty interesting, especially considering how physically close, geographically close India and Pakistan are to China. I'm not exactly sure why that is. It's potentially travel bans that they are introducing there, but also this could be pointing to some of the theory that warmer weather could eventually help, as well as in some of the African countries that we're not seeing much going on there. A second group of countries that are having a pretty good successful part are some of the East Asian countries that were on the first line of this pandemic. So places like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, outside of the cluster that happened related to the church, they already got hit and they already took the brunt of that wave, but they're for the most part holding things together there. So what are they doing and what can we learn from them? We've been hearing a lot, and Rex started to talk about some of those draconian measures that they're taking to keep this under control. And I really do think That's the secret to how we get past this crisis in the West. Third group of countries that have been relatively doing well so far, North American countries, Mexico, Canada, United States. We did have the early travel bans, and those did make a big difference to slow this down. It might have only slowed it down a month or something, because we are starting to see it hit now. So that helped, but it's been, unfortunately, the coronavirus has been finding a new way in via the EU. One other just observation, just from reading all the information, and I think part of this is there's so many different dimensions of the story. You have to take all that data in and try to combine it and see what's going on, is that you're seeing lots of stories about actually this disease right now is hitting higher income individuals in the United States. So it has a little different story than what was happening in China. The early cases we've been seeing here, lots of people like lawyers, NBA stars, politicians, bankers, actors, ER doctors. That makes some sense when you actually look at the way that who has the means to actually travel to Europe and other parts of the country on vacation. So, but the outbreaks are happening in these kind of areas in the United States in this first wave, which is pretty interesting. One other piece of background facts that I think is also important to look at is when you look at those numbers by country, we're now already worse. The infection rate is higher in the West than in the East, even though we've had a longer period of time to prepare for this. And so why is that going on? Is it because we have a more dense urban living population? No, that's not the case. Maybe it's a cultural practice differences of why we're having a more severe reaction to this right now. You could look at the situation like what's going on in Italy. They have probably, the Italian cultural greetings are more susceptible to this than East Asian. You think about bowing versus hugging or kissing. So that could be something. But the counter to that is in China, especially, you've got family style eating. So that's not all of it. So I think one of the biggest reasons why we're having a actually more severe outbreak in the West is because of the difference in experience. When you look at places like China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the consumers, the people on the ground have already dealt with SARS, MERS. So they already have an immediate reaction as people, as society, as well as, as a nation. They open up their closet and they pull out gloves and masks and sanitizer. They're not rushing to the store to get this. They already have it, most likely. You saw that the governments had extremely, these swift draconian measures to lock down their borders. That happened very fast. And you look in the West, the EU especially did not really have that kind of response. The US did it early on, but again, we still don't have that secondary piece. It's the quick lockdown and quarantines combined with the behavior of the consumers on the ground. And we still don't have that in our culture. We still go to work. I mean, there's a recent study that showed that 90% of Americans go to work sick. And so that's got to change. So we really do need to have an all of society, or as government's talking about, all of America approach to this threat. It's absolutely critical. Just one other chart here, just to kind of put the scale of why we need to really wake up to just how serious this is. This is the last 102 years of global catastrophes. 102 years ago, we had the Spanish flu. So flu can be really bad. Influenza, guess what? Spanish flu is a flu. Flu can be very serious. Approximately 50 million people perished in that. The worst thing that's happened, in recent times is the 75 million people who perished in World War II. And we're looking at something, if we were to do nothing and just everyone ignored this, we're talking about something that shows up on that same scale. So this is really, really serious stuff going on. But by implementing extreme draconian actions right now, we can completely avert this crisis. So it's within our control to not walk off the edge of this cliff. So I don't think that future is going to happen, because we are starting to see the green shoots of people actually taking this extremely serious. But we need to act right now. Everyone needs to act right now and change their behaviors. One more slide here to try to help people wake up just to see what these numbers really mean. I did here what's called like a time alignment analysis, basically lining up where we are in this outbreak relative to Italy. and I adjusted it for population size. So you can see when you line up in time where we are with the number of cases, the caseload, to Italy, where they were a couple of days or weeks ago, we're somewhere between 9 and 15 days, maybe 14 days behind them. So in 14 days, if we do nothing, and maybe if we still do something, because there's this incubation period, we'll be looking like that. This is not some abstract thought way out in the future. We're talking about like at the end of next week, the end of the month, we could be facing, you know, this situation. So this is coming very fast. So now I want to go into a little bit of the business implications here, because I think this story has tentacles going in every different direction. There's some of the data, if you look on Rex's website about, you know, McKinsey estimates, I think that actually the far-reaching tentacles of this are even more than that. There's the obvious areas of cruise lines, airlines, hotels, restaurants. We just had all the restaurants shut down in the New York City area. I mean, there must be 1 million people working in those restaurants. I don't know what that means, but it's serious. But there's other things as well that are going to get impacted by this. Life insurance is ugly stuff, but life insurance companies, the actuarial tables, there's systemic assumptions that are built in there that may be different than they were expecting. We've been talking as an industry about the retail apocalypse. Well, this is not good as far as that's concerned. And we've also lived in an expansion of 13 years where all these financial entities, private equity, VC, hedge funds, bankers, there's a mindset, a mantra of your margin is my opportunity, where companies live on the razor edge indefinitely. Well, I don't know if anybody in the system was preparing for this kind of systemic shock. So when you're living on the edge, what does that mean? It's something very concerning to me. And the education system, I mean, that's very hard for parents here, what's going on right now with everyone being sent home. So this is very serious. Trying to look for the bright spots in the situation from a business perspective. I do think there's something fundamental happening right now with this DTC revolution. So I want to talk about that and just go deeper in that. Again, we could spend a whole day talking about all the different issues right now that are related to this. Other areas that could have some benefits: strategic manufacturing being brought back to the United States, e-commerce, delivery and shipment businesses, automotive. We're going to need a lot more drivers, a lot more people delivery in the near term, and that could drive a different way. The oil is rapidly falling, but that may help offset that somewhat. Real estate changes in terms of optimization and what people are looking at, as well as entertainment changes. People starting to go back to some more traditional forms of entertainment in the short term. So the first wave of this, obviously, from business impact, it hits the stock market, and you saw with Rex numbers how delayed it's been, but they are supposed to be looking forward. And to put this in perspective, 2008, we had the Great Recession. We had about a 4% dip in GDP. I don't know what's going to happen here, but we see some industries already projecting 70% declines in revenue. So that's a really big number. Now, also, if you don't read finance, you don't keep up with it, but some of these numbers here to take a look at that are particularly concerning is looking at things like gold and silver, and normally those actually go up in the market when equities fall because people are going to safe havens, but instead we're seeing them go down equally, and even in some cases things like bonds going down at the same time. And that only happens when there's panic selling and everyone's just looking to get the cash. So it's a very serious situation. These are already a couple days old, and you can see how much it's even fallen further from here. One other part of this story on the consumer side, we've lowered rates, and you would think, oh, now I can go refinance my mortgage. Well, interesting enough, you see that actually consumer credit is not going where you would expect to go. It's actually spiked up to about where we were 2 years ago, despite the 0% interest rate. So that's another part of this. In the EU, even worse situation. They're farther ahead of us on this story. And finally, from a millennial perspective on the finance piece of it, these individuals were the most exposed. Typically, they took very risky investments, have never seen a downturn before, so they don't have this kind of balance of fixed income and equities. But they're in things like cryptocurrency and using platforms like Robinhood. Well, right now they're getting absolutely hammered. So those individuals are extremely emotionally stressed out right now. So it's a serious situation. One of the biggest parts of the story to me is actually the social impact, social unrest that can come with this. We're already seeing some signs of this, the TP fights at Costco that you've probably seen online. When you send everyone home, all the children home in New York City, and all of that. So we need to do something as a society to minimize this part of the story as well. Looking at the media impact of this, we all have heard the news about what's happening with professional sports. I mean, I can't believe that NBA is canceled or postponed. I mean, that's just absolutely shocking, but it's true. So we're going to see, and we are seeing, consumers forced to change their media consumption habits. They're going into much more TV news, so that's one place that's obvious, health, financial properties, but there's other things they're moving to as well to take a look at for all of us. And this is the ARF, so all of us in advertising and brands. These consumers are going to places like Worldometer. I've never even heard of it, but it's got traffic going off the charts now. So things like this you can start to think about of how you can react to the consumers' changes in their behaviors. Now I want to go down. I said before I wanted to take this a little deeper into the effects on direct-to-consumer behavior for advertisers, and I think this is really important because there is a fundamental step change that we're all being pushed massively to direct-to-consumer consumption consumption behaviors. So I've just gone out in the last couple of days and seen what's been happening with brands on the internet. I went to MarketWatch and I'm getting advertising, and it's for what I would call a hunker down brand. This is exactly what I want when I'm hunkering down in my house. I love oatmeal, and it's almost the perfect food. It's good for you, and it's cost effective and fills you up, and it's at a great price point. But so here it is, buy now. I try it. Well, not quite perfect in the execution yet. I was not able to get to this is a POS, but I wasn't able to convert here. So trying another site, found it, excellent. And I'm not able to convert here. I don't want to leave the house. So how can I get your product? So this is the question here. So let me give you a different example here. Out on the internet, I received this note from a company called TouchNote. TouchNote is an app, but it's really not an app. It's what I would call a communications technology adapter between digital and analog consumers. So what does that mean? I'll show you an example here. The CEO here said people are feeling isolated with the pandemic, and they've given them a free card to reach out to anyone that they know. So what this allows you to do is pick up your phone and send a postcard to your grandmother or whoever. And I just think that's the right response. This is an example of great advertising during this time. So here it is. Here, I did it myself. Here's a picture of the postcard. Put my baby on there and sent it to my 101-year-old grandma, who was born during the Spanish flu. So this is an example of excellent DTC and the kinds of things we can do when we're thinking about this from an all society approach. So looking at this in the bigger picture of DTC advertising, it has been a wave that's been picking up steam, but this is the explosion that really is a catalyst that drives DTC forward, in my opinion. So my takeaways for large legacy brands and traditional retailers, not to get overly complacent with short-term revenue spikes because of the hoarding and the pantry loading we're seeing right now, but to learn from this and to make changes now. We are seeing systemic changes in consumer behavior in the midterm. Consumers are preferring at-home delivery, even if it's at a premium. So you need to be thinking as a brand, can your consumer readily access your product for delivery? You need to be strengthening your DTC supply chain now. Have you designed SKU options that are optimized for home delivery? You might need to be thinking about the R&D to make lower weight options for your product. And stop following the herd mentality and looking at other large brands that may be shrinking, and start to look at some of these new brands that you may not normally look at as competitors for inspiration. This guy here in the middle is called Mike Lindell. He's the Pillow King. He's from my home state of Minnesota, and he's got $1 billion brand selling pillows. So there's some very different things happening right now with DTC, and it's just only going to accelerate it. If you don't take advantage of it, someone else will. And that's why I say welcome to the high tech, meaning the hygiene technology economy. Right now, the invisible hands of capitalism, via the gig economy, are redeploying things like ride-sharing infrastructure to this hygiene tech demand. I just, for the first time, went on to Instacart and I got my yogurt there. So it's really changing everything again, and it's happening very fast. People are taking advantage of this. Entrepreneurs are coming in and seeing the needs and making new technology rapidly right now. So just in summary, again, big picture from industry perspective, DTC is accelerating extremely fast right now, instantly. And we need to recognize those changes in consumer behavior and follow them accordingly. The other part of it is that we need to change our messaging. We can't go with the usual brand messaging that we've done for the past. We need to be very sensitive, like the touch note message there, that people are very stressed out by this right now. So that is critical. It's where are they reaching them there, but also changing the way that we interact with them. And consumers will be happy. They will be appreciative if you are sensitive to that. The bigger picture, the coronavirus outbreak is bigger right now in Western nations, and we do need to act now with an all-of-society approach. Inaction impacts not just you, but your coworkers, your neighbors, your friends, your family. It's not an option. Now, I don't want to be against so doom and gloom. I think there is plenty of hope for the future. It is going to get much worse before it gets better when you look at the data. But if we all do our part, the future is bright, and we can avoid a lot of the worst case scenarios. And finally, just to look at history again, there was the Spanish flu that happened, but it was shortly followed by the Roaring '20s, and we can have our own Roaring 2020. So this is not the end of the world. Everyone needs to be calm. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. Very, very useful presentation. And there have been a number of people who've been posting questions about the availability of both the slides and of the recording of this session. So those who missed that earlier, everything is recorded, the full slide decks, and which contain an enormous amount of very valuable information. This is a very proud ARF Empiricist Day. But all of that will be available and in links sent out to all registered participants. So you'll be able to share it with your colleagues who weren't there. You'll be able to review it. Thanks. So let me bring back Rex and also Rick for a bit of discussion, and again, encourage everyone to post their questions to the Q&A utility at the bottom of the screen. Rex, let me start by asking you to elaborate a little bit more on a point that you made in your presentation about location data. At the ARF, we love situations where data are collected for one purpose, but then we find that there's a broader sort of industry analysis, or in this case, a sort of public health analysis, that location data collected for an entirely different reason might actually be able to inform us now about the progress in social distancing measures and help to inform corrections to the models. Can you expand on that a bit more and talk a bit about how that data stream can be useful right now and how we might make that happen?
Yeah, so I've used location data for a while. Our partner at Marketing Evolution is Place IQ. Their data has been really helpful. I'm definitely going to be working with them. We're trying to get a huddle going around. I'm looking at other location providers, basically anyone who can provide the data. It's gone from being something that helps businesses sell a little bit more to truly being a life and death type of analysis, because what we are taking an experiment in the United States, which is different than what South Korea did, Singapore did, China did, what they did on Diamond Princess cruise, which is we are not doing a coordinated quarantine. We are letting local jurisdictions make the call and the decision. And that might be appropriate because rural areas are quite different than cities, but it is an unknown. And the big unknown is how much social distancing, physical distance do you need? How much of a change in consumer behavior do you need to see the R naught drop below 1 or much closer to 1, so that we either flatten the curve and preserve the capacity in the medical system, or try to arrest the virus and get it below that magic 1 part where one person passes it on to less than one other person. So what I saw in the location data that I've used before is that, wow, I can see how many people are potentially defined as staying home, how many people are going out to stores, to theater. I mean, we've seen theaters and restaurants and others closed, so presumably we'll see that go down. But can we find a way of calculating how often one location device comes within a certain 1 meter range of another location device, and use that to calculate how many different devices did you come in contact with per day or whatever. Now, the ideal measurement of that data would be to have that data for South Korea and Italy, and to be able to look that trend before and after, so that we can look at that magic 2 weeks where we see that the curve flatten down, and then say, well, that's the benchmark that we need to get to be sure that we're going to be in a safe zone in the United States. And I think playing that back to our political leaders, which is, okay, everything that we've done, washing our hands and not going to movie theaters and all these other activities that are going on. And by the way, thank you to Marketing Evolution's Customer Universal for now making first-run movies available at home the same day that would normally come out to the theater. All those things help, but we don't really have a measure to know how much is enough or even how much we've done. And so that feedback loop, I think, is going to be incredibly essential for policymakers.
So open question to Indy on this broadcast. If you have access to location data, get in touch, especially if you've got access to global location data. We'll follow up with that. Rick, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'll just speak a point of view first, which is, and this is not something that is born out of this crisis, but I really feel like advertising as an industry is a source of great social good. And I think it gets often a bad rap. In two particular respects, it really is the economy of media, and inasmuch the workhorse of free speech. And it also works in terms of amplifying sales, and in that effect is an amplifier on gross domestic product. And both of those things are more important than ever for us. Both keeping media free and accessible. We're seeing a lot of paywall sites lower paywalls, to release emergency information or critical information to the population. I celebrate that. And we're going to need the help of advertising to rebound all sorts of businesses. I'm just wondering, Jerome, you spoke a bit about the market implications, and Rex, you're close to that as well, and Scott, where you sit as well. I'm wondering if you're hearing advertisers, speaking of kind of mission statements at this point. I mean, I think a lot of people are still just in, reactive mode and damage control and assessing, cutting staff and other things they need to do to survive as businesses. I think it is critical that brands think of how they're advertising and messaging right now and how we'll think of them in the future based on that. And even some kind of altruism to help information and entertainment sources. Let's not, forget that we all need some comfort and, solace outside of just pure news delivery and social media anxiety. So I'm wondering if you're hearing companies, media companies and advertising companies taking those kind of approaches.
Yeah, I can start. Yesterday, I published a article in Research World on how businesses should scenario plan and action plan. And the recommendation was for businesses and the marketing teams to get together for at least half a day and begin by assessing what scenario they think is going to happen here. And there are some slides that we included around McKinsey's forecasts and Goldman Sachs forecasts and other financial forecasts for either a V-shaped recession or maybe not a recession, but a V-shaped recovery, maybe a mild recession, maybe a severe recession. You can come up with your own set of scenarios. But the question you should be asking is, depending on the scenarios, or maybe regardless of scenarios, how do you want to come out the other end? From this transition, and then you work backwards to then say, well, what does that mean about the actions and decisions we take? The first one we know is that companies are going to have to cut costs, and advertising is a very common target because the budget is flexible. And to some degree, I think it's going to mean that there'll be more pressure on the advertising industry to be more efficient, to be more automated. The best brands are defining themselves with the mission statement and working from that standpoint and recognizing that they can grow share during this period of time. But I think almost everyone is somewhat paralyzed by the question of, well, how much time are we going to take to go through the quarantine or not quarantine, or before we hit the top of this and we can get better. And that's why I felt it was important to share some of the data analysis that shows that we can get through this in about 2 weeks. Give it a month if you want to, because you have some cleanup to do in terms of case tracing and so forth, and testing backlogs and so on. But it's probably more valuable for the economy if we try to synchronize with the global community timing of quarantines that allow us to get back to rebuilding the economy. And until we have clarity around that, what I'm seeing is businesses more paralyzed under the question of how long does this last, and not having a definitive answer.
Certainly the questions that we see at the ARF from ARF members reflect, a large amount of anxiety about the uncertainty. So we get a very big spike in questions about marketing in a recession, about the liability to companies of going dark. We at the ARF don't view advertising in a narrow context of just being paid media. Advertising is in some ways almost all aspects of the ways that companies and brands present themselves. So, if you do wrong by your customers in any way, or examples as Jerome had of being tone deaf and of not acknowledging the anxiety that's out there, then you're advertising, but not necessarily in a positive way. But Jerome, do you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a couple of examples now that are starting to show up of brands reacting in a really altruistic way. Louis Vuitton, the mothership of Louis Vuitton, they just recently converted a lot of their technology, their manufacturing that was used for perfumes to create sanitary, hand sanitizers in the short term. So they're doing that and they're giving it all away for free. And I think that's kind of an example of someone saying that this is not about money right now. I'm going to do what's right for society. And people are going to, in the long run, remember that and appreciate that. So that's a great example from a brand perspective of taking a very high road here, even though there may be short-term pain from doing that. From a publisher perspective, I think it's it's harder, but there is some role to play for sure. Obviously, the importance of the news media and what they the function that they've traditionally held in America, it's super important right now, getting the information out. And just to add the technology dimension to that, from a publisher perspective, we have all this great single source or one-to-one programmatic technology that we've built up over the year. I mean, maybe just like there was the health alert systems that were built out of, in the television system, where you get an alert and you could get information that way. The programmatic pipes, we can do localized advertising that's for, a public good. So if the government needs to reutilize the pipes that we've created from technology, I think publishers would be open to that, to getting message out, because not everybody watches TV, especially the younger millennial population, which is a really important part of how we solve this problem, in my opinion. They may not be doing all the same things we're doing. They may be still going about their lives as they normally do on the beach in Florida right now.
Right. Though the forecast that we're seeing now for TV consumption, during the present moment of social distancing, look like there's like a huge amount of I think Nielsen's forecasting a 60% increase.
Yep.
In just the amount of time spent with television, mostly to the benefit of linear TV, and certainly one of the interesting consequences, since the production of quality video or programs is really being slowed down, if not completely stopped, because you can't really do that the way we're doing this. I mean, doing high quality video production involves people being close together. And we've seen already with infections of some stars and things like that. So the companies that have deep vaults of content that they can use to satisfy this moment are probably going to be in better shape. And it'll be a very interesting process to see how it works out over the next, say, 2-year period, and whether it changes some of our approaches to production. But the paradox that I'm seeing is that most of the population of the country is very, very focused on this news right now. But most advertisers are really leery of being anywhere near it. So you're getting very interesting price distortions in ad inventory, where the people are, the marketers are often not following. And I think I'd be interested to see whether this has negative effects for many of the news media that are having to invest more in coverage in a sort of dangerous moment. But it's also creating market distortions. I wonder whether others on the panel have thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, you've nailed it. That seemingly paradoxical relationship between media consumption and advertising dollars is driven because most brands have not worked through the process of what should they be communicating, and how do they act in this moment. I mean, I wrote my first article around businesses needing to do their scenario planning back in February, hoping they'd be ready for this time. But I rewrote it and updated it yesterday, because I feel like many of the folks are just now figuring out, okay, we really have to have a strategy and plan here. I mean, the other thing that I think that's going to happen is that brands need to reconsider their positioning. So one of the examples I used was of a luxury car brand who may have focused on being seen in this wonderful car with all these great features, and very much a status-oriented luxury positioning, and how that might shift under a scenario where this, the economic drama, continues, and consumer psychology shifts into a extreme form of cocooning that I call fortress home. Fortress home was something that I saw happen in the 90s, which when people began to turn more inward, status began to become, stealth wealth and hidden. And people began to prioritize social values like safety and security, and home security systems might be well advertised, or other things that make people feel safer. And the whole luxury car positioning could still be the same vehicle, the same product, but now it's positioned around it's a car that's going to get you home safely. It's a car that's going to take care of the safety of your family. It's a car with great features that are going to melt away your stress. It's a car that has the advanced air filtration system, so you're breathing the purest air possible. I mean, those are the same physical product, but a completely different position. Every brand has to think through their scenarios about, do you think it's going to go as extreme as fortress home and you need to reposition? Or is this going to be sort of a blip, and if you were there for the people when things were down, they appreciate you and you don't have to do a whole lot more to your overall brand? I think that that's the moment that brands need to work through PDQ.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for brands right now. You know, there's been this big movement for the last several years that I forget what our preferred jargon is, but you know, social messaging, showing that the brand has a conscience about the environment and other kinds of social good. I mean, I would think it would do well for major, I don't know, any kind of brand, CPG or other, just to take that position, probably on the cheap, on the front page of the New York Times and other news sites, and just say, you know, we are here to support information and, you know, and media right now, and just have your logo. I remember something, Rex, from the work you did with the IAB back in the late 90s that we collaborated on, where you had some best practices on creative that showed that, you know, have your logo on the ad from the start of the rotation. Don't, you know, do like a teaser and then show the brand at the last moment because people have scrolled past the page. It always stuck with me. It always struck me that maybe just your logo is the single most important thing in terms of ad effect. And if you just have that P&G logo at the top of the New York Times and say, we are here for America right now, that's probably more than enough. You know, you can get the rest of your, because as you were just describing, those, you know, I could see even a cynical backlash to luxury car air filtering systems or something like that. I mean, just be there as General Motors for America right now. Keep the media flowing. I think that would help.
So one of the things that's interesting to me is that several of the companies that provide internet access, and of course, the demand on the internet is spiked incredibly. We're contributing to that at the moment. But you know, the internet service providers and broadband providers have in various ways tried to make public accommodations, reducing caps on data and dispensations to low-income households and things of that sort. These are the same folks responsible for building out 5G. And one of our questions from the audience comes from Michael Diamond, wondering about whether this will accelerate both from an infrastructure perspective and from the perspective of applications leveraging connectivity, whether the rollout of 5G itself might be affected by this episode.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of technologies that are accelerating. So back to the point of the opportunity during this period of time, 5G, absolutely. Telemedicine, absolutely. 3D printing. There was a story about a hospital running out of parts for the ventilators and someone coming over the 3D printer and showing them how to make it. And I've got twin kids on the robotics team that I've seen build these things. I'm like, wow, okay. I can see how now that goes from, okay, my kind of geeky kids that I'm proud of, you know, building stuff to, you know, more mainstream when you think about, you know, maybe more businesses need to have the flexibility or even more households. I mean, some of them will still be fringe, but it will go from being ultra fringe to less fringe. So in our industry, and I think in a lot of business ones, you're going to see machine learning and AI and other things that reduce cost and speed up data. I mean, one of the big frustrations if you are in the marketing industry is if you're depending on a marketing mix model that averages the past 36 months of data, you're screwed. I mean, you need to have data that is fresh and current, reflecting what's happening today, or at least this week. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for a lot of technologies to use this moment to speed up their adoption. So, you know, I think that there's some good news in that for the economy for sure. The thing that scares me about the economy on a broader sense is that right now what I see is that China took their medicine and did the quarantine that they needed to do. I think it's not long until you basically see travel restrictions on the United States on a global basis because we haven't done enough, and that they then are able to grow their economy at a fast rate and their businesses at a fast rate because they're more globally connected and they've gotten through this issue faster and better. And people want to see the technologies that they use. Things like facial recognition and thermal cameras. I was talking to a supplier who does thermal cameras. There's not one to be had for the next 3 months because every single one was purchased because it can read the temperature down to the pixel on someone's forehead to tell whether they have a temperature or not. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunities. I think it's time to say we have to do the things and connect with our political leaders to get through this faster. And then we need to be thinking about what does our world look like after this point, and how do we best make economic decisions that allow us to be in a good position based on those trends.
We have a few questions that have come in from the audience about research and the effect that this has on the conduct of research. And I summarize a few of them to kind of be about surveys or qualitative research. Obviously, you know, there you know, are going to be problems with doing anything face-to-face or focus groups that, you know, might be extended well beyond the immediate crisis. Is there a view on the panel that surveys, consumer surveys of any sort, are likely to be better, worse, or unchanged, to use a kind of a survey formulation, as a result, you know, in the present moment and beyond?
Yeah, I think they're hugely valuable right now. I mean, it's you can get nearly instantaneous information about what's going on the ground in the minds of a huge number of people, and you can sample that with all the technology today by market and region and see these differences. So, I mean, this is a time to be doing more research, more survey, consumer research, if anything. The brands should be accelerating those efforts. If you can reach them, they may be too busy doing other things right now. So that's the one piece, is that people may not be interested in even telling you their opinion right now. But if you can reach them, I think you should be finding out what they want and listening.
Yeah, I know, Rick, if you have a comment on this as well, because you're seeing the volume on the wants list. But I think one of the things that I saw was that you know, someone had posted that the record RFPs inbound for survey research. I would suspect that actually cooperation rates will go up a little bit because people want to have their voice heard more. And I think survey data in this moment in time, I agree with Jerome, it is instantaneous and fast. And it allows you to control for the noise of sentiment, which I think will be much harder to read about brands right now. And I think it actually becomes really important to begin to track this on a daily basis so that you can see when intention begins to turn around for your brand or interest in purchasing your brand. I mean, if you have a brand tracker, you might want to add some omnibus questions or different things to gauge how people are relating to this moment to make it relevant to them. But I think that this is, it just really underscores how valuable and important it is to be able to have a structured, organized dialogue with a representative population.
Yeah. I would just urge people to do their best work, because we don't want to clutter up, you know, the systems with a bunch of cute PR flashy, you know, kind of surveys and so forth. I wanted, if I could just quickly make one more appeal, an opportunity in media for media companies. Maybe you can see I'm sitting in my 7-year-old's bedroom right now. And, you know, like many of you and many Americans, my wife and I are both trying to be productive, working at home while homeschooling our kid, which we have no experience in. And we've, you know, seen great success, if you want to call it that, you know, in this generation of young children being, spending a lot of time on devices with homemade content and so forth. My child could watch these daily generated videos by this brother and sister called Sis and Bro endlessly. And there was Ryan's toy review, which we went through previously. And the problem is, you know, and then I'm not much of a gamer, but we do let him do Minecraft and, you know, some of these other things. But there is an urgent need for that same kind of stickiness with children for something that's more educational, because we're all just scrambling right now to figure out, what the school's recommending for home learning and so forth. But I mean, if there were two teenage kids with the same kind of energy as Sis and Bro, who all they do is play video games, and you watch as they're playing the video games. But if they were talking about math or physics or I don't know, anything more educational, I think that would be extremely valuable. And I would, and the same kind of intelligence in the game, let's call it addictive, kind of behaviors that they capture with that. If we could do it towards more educational content, I think you'd find a huge audience among a lot of parents who'd be happy for that.
Well, check out scratch.ed or it's scratch.edu. It's MIT's block-based coding program. It's great for somewhere around third grade and up. It is a phenomenal way for them to express their creativity and learn that they can control and build and create things and learn programming. Highly recommended. I also think that there's this opportunity. I'm in the state of Nevada, and I think about what will happen with the casino gaming industry and how long it will take to recover from this. And one of the things that I tweeted my senator was, we really ought to be thinking about, along with the unemployment, compensation, helping people to reskill and to retrain around the areas where we'll have more jobs and have more demand. I know, we've got the Tesla Gigafactory not too far from where I'm at. That's one that people could skill up and change from the service industry up into that industry, and programming and technology. So I do think that there's a moment here where we can take advantage of the time and opportunity we have to reconnect with our family and try to keep ourselves healthy and working out, and our kids, intellectually nourished. And we probably need more inspirations. And maybe that's a role of some of the brands to be able to think about the things that they can partner with that's helping promote a better world for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, we are pretty much out of time, so I'm going to take this moment to thank the panelists for a very informative presentation. As I say, I think we've done the ARF proud. We are, of course, an organization that believes that evidence matters, data matters, and this is a very good application of that. We intend to continue this. We won't be able to have our big face-to-face meetings for a while. So this is the first of a series of town halls on that will be open to everyone on matters of public interest. We will also be having some member-only events virtually. So stay tuned for that. Go to www.thearf.org if you want further information. And thanks to all for attending. Very good session. Thank you.
And feel free to join the Wonks list, researchwonks.com. Check it out tomorrow because the site is going to be relaunched then.
Awesome. Keep up the good work, guys.